welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is an illustrious panel. I won't get a chance to introduce you in your full set of details. There will be a short introduction, but that's, I think, because everyone can look you up on your latest Wikipedia article, I'm sure. But this particular panel, I was super excited to be able to moderate because actually I don't know much about it. And I think that's the problem, right? There's this idea of inclusion as an important lens into the whole climate change debate is something that we've been missing. We haven't been talking about it enough. I've been working on climate change for close to 20 years. I don't think I've spent enough time understanding this. And so let's start that conversation. And I can't think of a better group of three folks to do that with than with Rima Ban, Rima Nanavati, Padma Shri awardee and director of SEWA. Someone who's representing over a million women, unionized women. So it's a really interesting perspective on what they're going through. Archana Soren, who is the member of the United Nations Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. So very important constituency, young people, but also someone who proudly represents her own tribal heritage and the voice of indigenous and tribal people. Again, a really interesting perspective that we don't hear enough about. And then we have Shloka Nath, who's the executive director of the Indian Climate Collaborative, which really takes a sort of an India-wide institutional perspective on what are the conversations we should be having on climate change and how do we take leadership. And one of those conversations is about just transition, about thinking about the effects of climate change on many different populations and ensuring that we're taking that into account as we think about action. So really great to have these different perspectives in. And I'll just kick it off. For those listening, and I know we'll also be taking some questions on Facebook and so forth, and Sanjana might feed them to me. I will try and reserve a little more than 15 minutes for audience questions if we get there at the end. But Shloka, I might kick off with you because I guess with a little bit of a macro perspective, why is this conversation actually important? Because if you look at, at least how climate change has always been explained, it's lots of numbers, it's big numbers. It's about figuring out where the carbon's coming from. It's about trying to get the policies, the taxes, the prices, the science, right, and the innovation around it so that we, reduce, mitigate and adapt. Like, why is it important to really be also thinking about inclusion? Is this an important enough debate to be having? What's your thoughts?
Thanks, Gaurav. I mean, it's a great opening question. And I think it's one that's going to get all three of us, you're going to get fairly sort of passionate answers from all three of us, I bet. That opening question for me is like when someone asks me why we should care about cryptocurrency. It's just, a fact of life now. We sort of have to think about things in a more sort of, I think, inclusive and diverse way. But really, I think for me, the first thing that I want to point out is that we aren't keeping up with climate change because the climate movement itself silences the very people who often feel the greatest impact of a warming planet. So we need to increase diversity in our solutioning in order to widen our reach. And that in turn will allow us to address, green issues on multiple fronts. And that also allows us, of course, to bring a greater focus to climate justice. And I think climate justice is something we're going to talk about a fair bit on this panel. So I'm not going to get into it right now. But just to give you an example, climate change is expected to have major consequences for the availability as well as quality of water. It's going to lead to more intense and frequent natural disasters. So the impact on people with little capacity to adapt, such as the poor, is going to be disastrous. And that's because India's climate story is not only about livelihoods, it's also about lives. It's a human impact story. It's deeply woven into our economic growth. It's a story about vulnerable populations. And it's going to be that way for the global South. So how we in India choose to shape that narrative is going to have, major implications for this part of the world. And that in turn, of course, is going to shape the global narrative. And that's a story we need to tell. It's not one that's being represented right now. Because again, as I said, climate change is a universal problem. but its impacts will not be uniformly distributed. So in addition to geographical location, you have factors such as race or caste or ethnicity, economic well-being, occupation, religion. All of these factors play a very decisive role in how individuals will experience climate change. And part of the opportunity in addressing climate change is really recognizing that it goes hand in hand with addressing the groups that are disproportionately impacted by it, namely the socially and economically marginalized. So I'll pause here, but happy to jump in on this later on in the conversation.
No, and I think you've set us up well. And we'll circle back. I'll come back on this question of blind spots, because I want to understand how it is that certain policies are then formulated that could have been much better formulated if they were thinking about these groups. But you mentioned some of these groups, and let me turn this to Rima Ben, who I know has an interesting video for us to watch as well to sort of kick us off. But as someone who is representing over 1 million unionized informal working women in the country, I think you have a very unique perspective on exactly what Shloka is talking about in terms of how is climate change disproportionately affecting them. And so if you can take us a little bit inside their lives and help us understand what are the differential ways they're experiencing this, that would be great. But would you like me to key that video first for you?
Thanks, Gaurav, but not now, but maybe when I come to the action part, because I want to touch upon what Shloka Ben just mentioned, that climate change is not just affecting the livelihoods, but also the lives. And I speak here on behalf of the 2 million women workers, the members of SEWA, all in the informal sector. And I think I'm so excited with this panel today, because I think we have to catch up on actions not taken since Paris. And due to, maybe it's in, shaping of NDCs getting delayed, or due to the pandemic delay, or whatever are the reasons. But I think, as Shloka Ben was just referring, these climate actions or the shocks that they bring into the lives of the members with whom I work and for whom I work. And I want to give you an example of a small farmer, Anju. And she's a small farmer having just a 1 acre plot of land. And the family was surviving on that. So they are a family farming household, the husband, the wife, and 3 children. And, first we had the pandemic, the lockdown, and then we also experienced the horrible cyclone. And her harvest was all ready to be taken to the market, the vegetables that she grows. The markets were closed, transportation was closed, and there her harvest was rotting. And on top of it, there was a cyclone. So what's the result of that on Anju's life? Can anybody imagine? They had mounting debt, which they had taken for the cultivation, could not sell their produce, and therefore there was absolutely no income, with a prolonged lockdown for 3 months. And as a result, there was so much of anxiety, tension. Children were at home. There was no foods. And on top of it, she became a victim of violence. And I think when we talk about climate, we just forget, that what do women suffer when it comes to climate crisis or when it comes to climate shocks. Let me give you an example of an urban waste collector. She moves around in the streets of our cities from 4 a.m. in the morning till about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. She collects all the waste. And lo and behold, there's a heavy, incessant rainfall. The waste is all washed away. She segregates all the waste on the pavements, and now she just has no shade, so she cannot segregate her waste. And she goes without food for days and days and days together. So it impacts the food security, the nutrition, the health, the education of the children, and on top of it, the kind of exploitation, both mental and physical, that she goes through. And I can give you countless these kind of examples. And therefore, I think what is urgently the first and the foremost thing is that the first is to catch up the delay with accelerated pace and larger amounts of investments in the climate actions, especially focusing on women. Second, I think we must reduce the carbon footprint, but accelerate the employment generation, green and clean jobs. Maybe it is solar energy, wind energy, forestry, water harvesting, clean air, whatever we could think of. And how can the younger women be involved in these kind of meaningful and decent, then only we can talk about just transition. Otherwise, we can always talk about transition, but it is transitioning of the large corporations, of the governments, but it doesn't really percolate down to the women in the informal economy that I'm talking about.
That's very passionately argued, Rima, and I want to come back to talk about solutions as well, because you're talking about just transition, but also the women that you are, the group that you're part of, also is looking at how do they become part of the solution itself, and I think that would be really interesting to look at. Archana, over to you, because while I've seen people talk a bit about gendered impacts of climate change, I do wonder how indigenous voices, tribal voices are brought into that equation, who often will have a very different relationship with natural resources, have a very different political environment, a very different level of voice. So I guess maybe my first question is, do you think indigenous voices, and I want to come back to youth as well, by the way, but do you think indigenous voices have a seat at the table here? Are they included in the discussion? And if not, how can we make that how do we do that better?
I would like to say that, when we talk about indigenous peoples and climate action altogether, indigenous people have been in the frontliners for climate action. And it's not from today, but it's from generation altogether because of the way of living and their intrinsic relationship with nature. But it is very unfortunate, and it's very sad that their contribution and their traditional knowledge and practices of climate action and biodiversity conservation has not been recognized adequately. We do have reports which has emphasized on the contribution of indigenous people. Specifically, if we take the IPCC report, it duly recognizes that rights recognition of indigenous people is very crucial for climate action, and also it emphasizes on the need of meaningful leadership of indigenous people, and also acknowledging the traditional knowledge and practices. But if we see in the contemporary era, since past few years, slowly and gradually, the world is listening to the perspective of indigenous people, or has started listening to the perspective of indigenous people. But yet, I feel a lot more needs to be done when we talk about indigenous people in the decision-making process. Because one thing which is very crucial is that we cannot undermine the fact that participation is very much interlinked with the human rights violation which is happening on the indigenous people, the land grabbing, the imposition of the developmental worldview, extractive developmental projects, migration, displacement. All of this is very much interlinked with a meaningful leadership and participation of indigenous people. And therefore, I feel it is very important by the decision-making spaces. And specifically, if we talk about climate action and Paris Agreement goals, countries need to emphasize more in terms of participation of indigenous people and recognizing their rights and traditional knowledge in the NDCs itself, to which many countries have done, but there are a huge chunk of countries who are yet to incorporate it. So I would also like to emphasize that both in terms of the global level and national and local level, a conscious effort of making indigenous people participate or give them a space in the decision-making process, a lot more work needs to be done.
Archana, can you say a bit more about that with respect to, let's say, India, right? So how are we faring on that front in terms of getting that voice heard?
If we talk about Indian context, we really have a lot of potential. Because we have a huge population of Adivasis and forest dwelling communities and tribal communities in India. And they have been immensely contributing towards climate action and biodiversity conservation through the traditional knowledge and practices. But I feel it is very important for India also to take this as a very important opportunity and also to work emphasize more rigorously in terms of ensuring that the indigenous people's voices are incorporated in the decision-making spaces. And the NDCs of India also needs to emphasize more in terms of indigenous people's participation and also supporting and acknowledging their traditional knowledge.
Okay. Well, Shloka, you've now heard, quite similar perspectives, but from different angles, right? And I guess I said I would come back to you about how, it's one thing to just have a conversation around inclusion and these are the different experiences of people, but how are you seeing these kind of perspectives? How would they actually get included in decision making? I know you guys are thinking about just transition, so how do you actually make something turn into influence on decision as opposed to a conversation that we're all having on Zoom, right?
Great question. Again, I think there are two sort of aspects to this or ways to perhaps demonstrate what we mean or what the complexities are behind sort of moving it into decision making and how we can do that. Maybe I can just start off by sort of illustrating the complexities around sort of, why it's so difficult to sort of quantify what inclusion really means when we talk about it through the lens of climate change and what it means for sort of, policy measures. I think the first thing to say is that, sort of policy making from the last decade has contributed towards establishing a very scientific basis for climate change as a global crisis. But we have failed to comprehend and acknowledge the social as well as human dimensions of that problem. And so what we've seen are essentially a set of responses that are primarily technocratic and, very economically oriented. But there is a glaring absence of a focus on marginalized groups. And there's, of course, an asymmetric distribution of power between the affected stakeholders. Just to give you an example, we've recently started working on a report around gender and climate change at the ICC. And, it's fascinating because the research itself is so complex and we seem to have barely scratched the surface in terms of understanding sort of the social dimensions around, gender and climate. So to give you an example, right now when we talk about sort of gender, that base for inequality is already intertwined with and also reinforced by other structures of domination. And there's a tendency for oversimplification. So for instance, what happens is when we talk about gender, it's often reduced to very narrow man-woman binaries, where women are depicted as vulnerable or marginalized victims, or they're simply given the role of caretakers with some almost special sort of divine connection to nature. And so what we do here, and there's a very real risk of reinforcing categorizations and not taking into account how differences are socially constructed, they are very context specific, and they may also shift when it comes to those realities around climate change. So, not only are we fixing sort of, marginalized communities into fixed categories, we're also excluding those who do not fit in these static categories. So it denies a whole amount of social struggle. It denies the complexity and fluidity of identities. So we really have a long way to go when we talk about sort of understanding or even building that base around intersectional analysis in relation to climate change. And we have not done this to any significant extent. So I just want to sort of make that very clear. The other thing I want to point out in terms of sort of how we move from, sort of pontification over Zoom to really like what we're seeing on the ground is that, we are really sort of seeing a number of organizations on the ground here in India who are really starting to sort of put that to practice. There are organizations who are really looking to sort of bring into account, women's roles when it comes to, not just sort of being the victims of climate change, but really how they are, of course, the agents of change. Rima Ben can talk about this, better than anyone on this panel, because her organization is literally doing that on the ground. There's a massive social transformation that they've taken on to sort of solve for the climate crisis at a scale that we've really never seen before. And so she's really leading on that front. But yeah, it's a really sort of challenging issue. We have an opportunity to really design and implement solutions that look to sort of solve this huge challenge, but it's not going to work unless those solutions are incredibly inclusive. I can give you a couple of other quick examples in terms of sort of what we're trying to do with the ICC, just sort of adopting, a very inclusive model to how we might sort of bring about some of those changes within climate change. So just again, we're adopting a number of sort of knowledge products which look at nature-based solutions, but again, through the lens of, communities, and ensuring that those voices are brought to the forefront, because that's the only way we're going to provide enduring outcomes. And ensuring that human well-being is placed at the forefront. So I think there's just a whole range of sort of opportunities. But I think, again, we have to sort of look at closing those very sort of knowledge and finance gaps around climate change in a way that is, empowering communities, bringing forward those voices who are impacted the most, and ensuring that we're driving resources to interventions in areas that are not being highlighted or are disproportionately impacted.
Thanks, Shloka. And I think, do we have time for filling all those knowledge gaps, right? There's going to be a question around that. So I'm going to come back to you, but I want you, if I grant you a wish, which I have no business of granting, which is that if you could change one or two policies in India on climate change to make them more inclusive, what would they be? And I'll come back to you so you can think a bit about it. But you opened the door to Rima about the work that's going on the ground, right? And I do think that at times inclusion often is seen as a defensive posture of, well, I want to be included because I'm a victim. But what all of you have said is, I want to be included because I'm also a solution provider. And so Rima Ben, it'd be great to hear about these 2 million women and how they're thinking about not just obviously the challenges that they're facing that you so eloquently described, but this transformation that Shloka referred to. I think our listeners would really find that interesting.
Sure. Let me say that, poor and amongst the poor women, they do not wait for either the governments or the policymakers to come and change their world. I think for them, innovation is one of the coping strategies. And in order to meet with, or in order to mitigate the climate crisis, what the women have to do is that, take on newer challenges, take on risks, and how do they also innovate? And I would just like to show that video now, Gaurav, that how can a very, very illiterate woman working in the remote desert areas, how she changes her destiny when she is determined to overcome her challenges, and especially the climate-related challenges. Can we see that video, please?
We'll get that playing right now. Sanjana, are you able to help us with that?
Yes, I'm on it.
મારું નામ જમનાબેન છે અને હું મીઠા કામદાર હોઉં. મીઠું અમારા બાપ દાદાનો ધંધો છે. ઈ જ અમારી આવરજ અને ઈ જ અમારી રોજગારી. અમે રાત દી મજૂરી કરવી, તડકો સાયો જોયા વગર, તારે મીઠું તમારે અહીંયા પોકે. કડા પગે દંતારો ખેંચવાનું થાય ને એટલે લાકડી પગ ભરતા. અમે અમે બધાયના સુવદનો ખ્યાલ રાખી બરાબર પણ અમારો કોણ રાખે છે ને ડીઝલમાં શું હોય કે ચાલુ કરતા કરતા આપી જાય રાતથી ધમાડા કાઢે અને પતી જાય તો રણની બહાર લેવા જવું પડે એ તો અમારા હારા નસીબ તે સેવાએ હાથ જાયલો એને અમારી ચિંતાએ કરી અને એને મદદે કરી તો સેવાના કારણે હું આ સોલર પંપ લઈ આવી આમાં તો કશું નહીં ચાપ પાડી પાટા ભર્યા કરે સોલર આયા ને પછી મારે મફતનો એક પાટો પાકે અત્યારે મેં 2 સોલર અહીંયા ઉતાર્યા હે મારે ઠામ કોઈ ડીઝલ નહીં એ મફતનો પાટો પાકે એમને 2 સોલર મૂક્યા હે એ ટેસ્ટથી પાટો પકી જાય અમારી મૂડીએ વધી અને રણમાં રહેવાની શાંતિ થઈ ગઈ સાચું કહું આ ડીઝલિયો કોઈને ગમતો જ નહીં ખરેખર સાચું હોય તો મારો સોનાનો સૂરજ છે
Remember, back to you.
Thank you. And so that's what I meant to say, that, if you leave it to the women, then they know what's the best solution. How can they address the climate crisis they have? So we could see that, it's not 1, 2, or 3 women, but today we have 7,000 such women, salt pan workers who have these solar pumps. And I think this was a major investment, 10 times more investment than a diesel pump, having a solar pump. But they partnered with a public sector bank, and that too without any collateral or any guarantee. And these women have repaid back the loan. So now they have an asset ownership of their own. And in the off season, it's the first ever women-owned solar park which has come up. And they've signed an agreement, a PPA with the Gujarat Energy Regulatory Authority. And now they sell the energy to the grid as well. So the women have both the sources of income, whether it's through the salt farming and in the off season, they earn through their solar park as well. I can give you several such examples, how the waste collectors recycle the waste. And the solar pumps now are also registered on gold standard. And so they earn carbon credits also up to 10 or 14 or $15 per credit. So I think there are innumerable these kind of examples that, how women organizing tree growers cooperatives and how wasteland is converted into a green farm forestry land. It becomes a demonstration center for thousands and thousands of rural communities. How do you work on farm top energy planning so that every household does energy farming and the surplus energy again? So you run your household using the green energy, the surplus goes to the grid and that becomes your source of income as well. So you also have the nexus of, farming on farm, off farm, and food processing, when all this nexus integrated with green energy and how it leads to, employment or livelihood opportunities, and also decent and dignified livelihoods for the youth as well. So what I would like to say here is that at the local level, the most returns, ecologic and economic both, it must go to women, and amongst women, poor women workers. So the NDCs or the national action plans must also generate widespread green jobs and jobs that are such as, for the artisans as well, for the farm workers as well. And it must be decentralized in terms of decision making as well as flow of funds.
And I think there's we'll come back to it, but there's a question on the chat, which I think is very relevant to this, because in a way, creative manufacturing and decentralized manufacturing as an opportunity as opposed to the way we have thought about made in India and how that could fit in the climate agenda. But I'll come back to it because I want to turn to Archana. There's a question I didn't get to ask you in the first round, Archana, which is, well, maybe I say this to my daughter, but it's like kids should be seen, not heard, right? And I feel like the way youth are described in climate change, it's like a little bit of guilt. We all realize we're borrowing from the future, so let's put some young people at the table. And you're a youth ambassador on climate change to the UN. I guess my question is, do you think you are seen, not heard there? Are youth voices kind of tokenism, or, are people listening?
No, I completely agree with what you say, that it has been immense youth tokenization over the past years. But if I see today's context, we youth have made it a point to call out youth tokenism as well. And we have been taking a very strong stance on this. Also, I feel it's very important for us, youth and also the entire climate movement, to be able to understand that how people are approaching us. Because it's at times it's very it looks really good to push forward for the youth participation, but again it's just for the token participation or for the events or workshop. But again, there is a serious demand from the young people that when there is any initiative or when there is any project undertaken by the national level or global levels, why are young people not ensured participation or not taken into consideration in terms of the planning, drafting, implementation, and the monitoring process? So yes, I would say that there has been tokenization of youth, and which we youth firmly call out on, and we would like to firmly say that youth tokenization will not take us anywhere in terms of climate action. And thus there needs to be meaningful leadership and participation of the youth in the climate action decision-making process. And at the same time, we would also like to emphasize that it is again comes down to willpower of the implementers and different stakeholders, because we have been raising our voice and we have been advocating in terms of climate action of how it has been affecting us and how it will be affecting our upcoming generation. It is also very important for the implementers or the global leaders to not only ensure that our voices are heard, but also take it into action. And that is what I feel is very important for us when we are on our way to COP26, that we want to push forward for more of action-oriented steps taken forward to all the demands of young people across the globe. And being a member of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group, I feel it's a great opportunity, because I feel this particular group, which has been formed by UN Secretary General, also gives us an opportunity to be very honest and be frank and fearless to him. And I think that safe and enabling spaces which Secretary General gives us to speak our heart out, whether it is in terms of criticism or whether it is in terms of solution, is something which is very much right now needed in the world, which also brings down to my other point of sharing, which is that we want youth to speak up, but are the youth safe for speaking up is also the next question, because we have seen that youths have been targeted and the voices of youths have been curbed down globally. And also, if we see in all the parts of the world, youth voices have been crumbled down and the voices have been curved down. So it's very important that we not only ensure that meaningful participation of the youth, but we also ensure that there is free, safe, and enabling spaces of young people to put across their voices and solutions.
Well put. And I have to say, I'm a little surprised that what you're describing, that at the UN, you get a chance to have a very unfiltered conversation with the Secretary General, which is actually great to hear. But I'm also, there's a question that Shivangi Adani has asked, and I'm going to ask it now rather than later, because both Shloka and Rima talked about nature-based services, right? And there's certainly some great nature-based climate solutions that we can talk about, which both address climate, create employment. You can regrow trees, you can improve water tables, and many types of activities that we could be paying for. But she is right in asking that there has always been this question on how it affects tribal communities, especially how they're represented in those opportunities themselves and whether they have a voice. And I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on whether there's some unintended consequences with respect to tribal communities from nature-based climate solutions and what we could be doing about that.
I think this is a really very important question, and I would like to say that yes, nature-based solution has a lot of potential, but it is also very important to understand that while implementation of nature-based solution, we have been facing immense challenges. One of the issues which is very, if I start with the first issues of nature-based solution, is we do not have a commonly accepted definition of nature-based solution. And this leads to a lot of problems when it comes down to implementation, because the lack of commonly agreed definition of nature-based solution also leads to a lot of misinterpretation while implementation. So it is very important that the perspective of indigenous people and different stakeholders is incorporated when we are creating or when we are adopting nature-based solutions. And the second thing which I also see in terms of nature-based solution is one of the ways is if we see that plantation of trees has also been resorted as one of the way of nature-based solution. And in this plantation, we see there has been a lot of instances of monoculture plantation, which has turned out to be really problematic in terms of the indigenous people. And also if we see in terms of plantation, in the rural areas, in the grassroots areas, there has been often instances wherein the indigenous people have been evicted for plantation drives, which is again gross human rights violation, which also brings to the point that natural forest cannot be compensated by planted forest or artificial forest, which also requires and needs to be taken into consideration that when we are talking about plantation drives also as a part of nature-based solution, it requires free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people. And also another thing, if we talk about a nature-based solution, it is also very important to take into consideration that if we talk about, there has been instances where we see that there is a lot of greenwashing happening in terms of nature-based solution, which again, we would like to reiterate that, you know, the harmful practices are kind of highlighted as one of the green solutions. So it's important to understand that what nature-based solution has potential, and if we really want to ensure and act effectively towards it, can bring wonders and it can be constructive changes. So we need to also stop ensuring that greenwashing is happening on that. Also, the last point which I see in terms of the challenges, like we need to completely understand that nature-based solution cannot be a substitute to cut emissions and fossil fuels subsidies. So it's important that not only with nature-based solution, we also need to push countries to cut their emissions and also fossil fuel subsidies, which is very, very crucial and important. And also if we talk about, I'll just give a small example to ensure about this plantation drives and monocultures. So when I was interacting in my field areas with the indigenous leaders, so the indigenous leaders said that people had come for plantation drives and we community members resisted. And I was like, why did you resist? What were the plants which the indigenous which the plantation drive people had brought? So they said they had brought fruit trees. So I said, fruit trees, which were the trees? So they said mango trees and jackfruit trees. So I, being from the indigenous communities, I was also surprised that what is wrong with, you know, jackfruit trees and mango trees being it's a fruit trees. But then the indigenous leader told that if this mango trees and jackfruit trees are planted in the periphery of a village, then wild boars will come, monkeys will come, and elephants will come. And in order to eat those fruits, they will destroy our agriculture areas or agriculture farming. And this will again lead to wildlife and human conflict. And that is why we don't want these plants to be planted in the periphery of the area of our village. And we want plants like sal tree. Then this was a very eye-opening perspective for me that if not the free, prior, informed consent is taken of the indigenous people, how there is implementation challenges, and how it again leads down to victimization of indigenous people and gross human rights violation of indigenous people, which is again intrinsic with the climate action. Like the climate action policies should not be in a way that it is making the indigenous communities more vulnerable and depriving them from their livelihood and peaceful way of living.
Actually, a great example of where, how inclusion is a method by how you improve a solution, right? It's not a blockage to a solution. It's a great example. Shloka, I had warned you that I was going to ask you about what is it that you would change, right? Like in terms of, you talked about how policy can be changed, and we need to learn more and so forth, but we don't have much time. So what are some changes in policy that you think we can enact to make sure we take a much more inclusive lens to climate change? And maybe you also do want to comment on the nature-based climate solutions, because I know you are looking at that.
I do, really quickly, and maybe I can start with that, because I thought, Archana, you did a wonderful job of sort of really summing it up in terms of those unintended consequences when it comes to communities and inclusion, specifically around, nature-based solutions and what those trade-offs are. I think three quick things that I can say where we have noticed, the obstacles perhaps to sort of, including or protecting community interests and voices when it comes to nature-based solutions. So the first is, when we look at regional level restoration plans and we look to design data or tools or capacity building for local stakeholders, what we've realized is that there is a significant amount of public capital in this country. Just for instance, the CAMPA funds, there's over 47,000 crores that are lying there that are available for restoration projects, but these monies are reserved for direct activities. So, afforestation projects or tree plantations. And what happens is, or what we forget is that protecting community and livelihood interests really does require developing a very landscape level plan that identifies and prioritizes their needs and has to ensure participation so that your restoration in nature is aligned with community interests, and that very often doesn't happen. So that's one sort of impediment that currently exists. The second is the fact that we don't really look at applicability across this country to sort of across specific agroclimatic zones. So, for instance, agroforestry right now is being considered a win-win in a very contested land use sector because it doesn't require the conversion of agriculture or pastoral or community lands for restoration. But we do have to look, across those agroclimatic zones. We need to see what the situation is, in terms of land use across rain-fed regions, for instance. So, successful pilot models have to be built, and that will hopefully, inform implementation. But those pilot models, of course, need to really take into account local contexts and how they vary across these different zones across the country. And again, that is really fed by sort of community level interventions and not a top-down approach. I think the third quick point I'll make on this is that the current sort of pool funding that's available for building capacities around nature-based solutions, specifically with regards to grassroots organizations, does not really exist. Most of the grant funding in sort of the nature-based ecosystem or solution ecosystem comes from international donors. But given current restrictions around FCRA, et cetera, smaller grassroots organizations are really unable to access that funding, and they are critical to supporting community-led efforts. We also need to sort of, really drive more regional diversity in grant making. And so these are just some ways in which we can sort of inform that bottom-up story when it comes to nature-based solutions. So again, I completely agree with everything Archana has said. I just wanted to sort of add to it from perhaps the funder perspective in terms of what those obstacles are and what we're trying to enable in the ecosystem now to drive, a more inclusive approach to nature-based solutions. To your first question around, what would I change? There's a very long list, as you can imagine, and this was a very difficult question to answer as a result. But I would say perhaps just looking at it more sectorally, there are two specific areas that really stand out for me. The first is around agriculture. And again, I suspect this is an area where Rima Ben can really speak to. But for me, what we've realized on the policy level, of course, and we know this, women do not hold land titles in their name, despite 65% of the total female workers in India being employed in agriculture. They are thus excluded from, availing of a plethora of government schemes that mandate land ownership. They don't have access to education or financial literacy. They're not viewed as a result as primary decision makers in the household. And of course, we know that agriculture and climate change are inextricably linked. So, for instance, crop failures can really push rural communities into severe poverty. They're compounded by those very small landholder sizes, very poor market linkages. So you have a majority of women who are coming to the forefront of the agricultural workforce, but they lack access to, everything from technology to training to credit, etc. I do want to say here that, while increasing women's land titles and creating supportive legislation, they're all promising steps, but they're very often mired in that complexity around implementation, So we do need to sort of look at developing other levers to support women's sort of ownership in this space, and really things like making sure that they have, existing social professional support networks or self-help groups, how are we promoting community, women community organizations under the state rural livelihood missions, ensuring that they get assistance in services related to agriculture, like microcredit and, supportive sort of cottage industries, etc. Those are really, I think ways in which we might be able to, as I said, assist the necessary levers or legislative changes that have to take place, of course, in a sector like agriculture to really ensure that women are included and protected as they should be. The second sector that comes to my mind is green jobs. And, this is just an area where I feel there is so much scope to increase, women as well as, underserved communities' participation in green industries. There's an opportunity to use green technology to enhance, current sort of women-led micro enterprises, and I think we're already seeing, when it comes to renewable energy management and proliferation, that rural women are such a tremendous sort of player in this whole piece. So many of them are already engaged in some form of cottage industry or agricultural work, which I've just mentioned, and could be sort of really further strengthened or supported by renewable energy access. I also think that we very often forget, even in things like solar energy, over 30% of the students studying engineering in India are female, which is one of the highest rates in the world, but they are largely absent from many core business segments. Look at corporate rooftop solar, you just won't find sort of women there. And there are many misperceptions around women's capabilities in these areas. And, we don't have enough gender sensitive workplace practices. The list is very, very long. But here I would say policy making as well as corporate organization are really, really important tools to further gender inclusivity in spaces like rooftop solar. And I think what you'll find is we could unlock a really new segment of very highly employable and educated and capable employees. So I'll pause here. I know it was a lot, but yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, and look, I think land ownership and the link of that to climate change is a really interesting one. Obviously, it's a long, age-old battle, but it manifests itself. So as you rightly say, in this climate debate as well. But on green jobs and maybe bringing Rima Ben into this, because there's even a question also on creative manufacturing, which I know in the Gujarat heartland is there's a huge amount of creative manufacturing that is waiting to be tapped. But I think there's a broader question here, Rima Ben, that I'd like to ask about, in a way, when you're working with 2 million women, you have the opportunity, and they have the opportunity to basically restructure things, right? Like that's you are able to take on climate action en masse. And some of that is about what is that new type of economy that we need to build, right? Is it a decentralized, localized, creative manufacturing as opposed to something that's far away and therefore quite willing to pollute and so forth. But even other opportunities that you talked about, right? And what Shloka just mentioned around local renewable energy managers and nature-based solutions being done better than they have been done before. So I'm just curious if you want to talk a little bit about the kind of green job opportunities that you've been seeing and that you as an organization are pushing, and how that sometimes also challenges the status quo, right? Because it's challenging current structures of how you know, the economy is built.
Great, Gaurabai. I wish we are able to restructure and change. You know, we are 2 million, but still we are very, very small. The carbon footprints are small, but yes, collectively, it could be a larger force as well. And definitely, and I think therefore, in order to do that, the green jobs that I am seeing a huge potential, which is there, is definitely in the space of solar. So how can we have women-owned and women-managed supply chains? We normally tend to see women only as the users or the end beneficiaries, but how can women also build their own supply chains where women also generate energy, they distribute energy, they manage energy related enterprises? And I gave one example of the salt pan workers, but we have women, you know, who are assembling solar lights, and they work as, you know, solar technicians in the villages. They do rooftop solar, they do solar home appliances, everything, and they have their little kiosks and little shops. So and they have their own handheld devices, so people can, you know, send them text messages, or they have an application. People can send voice messages and, you know, call them if their solar lights are not working or their solar home appliances are not working. The third area is, I think, where we need to look very differently is that how can we have village energy action plans? And when I say energy action plans, it doesn't limit it to just energy in terms of electricity, but it includes, you know, green farming, organic farming. Also, how do you have green or mobility as well, green transportation? And when these village action plans are consolidated based on household plans, and then how can there be village committees where the women are almost, you know, in equal numbers, and every village gets incentivized when their plans are almost implemented between 70 to 80%. And those are the kinds of policy actions which are required if we really want to create green jobs. So we have villages in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, and now in UP, where the entire transportation and mobility is not based on fossil fuels. We have, you know, people creating household level energy farming. We have battery chargers, solar battery chargers at every, like you have your petrol pumps or, you know, gas stations. You have charging stations where you have, you know, 8 or 10 batteries charged. So if I want to replace my battery because I just realized that, you know, the charging is running out, and I can still continue with my journey forward or with my transportation. So I think there are enormous potential and, you know, new kinds of livelihood opportunities which excite the youth as well. We have solar powered cold storages, and, you know, we have those little Denso scooters with those cold storages. And now we have the vaccinations, the COVID vaccines, which are ferried from village to village using those mobile solar powered cold storages. So you can think of, different areas where you could look at how the employment opportunities are created, and definitely handmade. So how do you have headbands which are solar torch operated, and you pluck flowers or vegetables early in the morning, you segregate them and send them to the markets, you hit them right on time for the time that the traders come and do the auctioning for it. I can think of solar powered looms that we have in Anand and in Surendranagar, where all the weaving is done using those solar powered looms. So I don't need switch over from a hand loom to a power loom. It is still a power loom. It is still a jacquard loom, but it's operated using clean and green energy. So I can give you countless such examples. And so it's not old fashioned. So you are in sync with, what modern trends and technologies are, but you're very mindful that you are not harming the environment. You are not degrading the environment, but you are always regenerating your environment. And I think, therefore, what is really very important is that the NDCs must lead to family action plans, where, the women are the main and the key planners for family action plans. In the end, the opportunities are not at the advocacy level. Of course, we do need advocacies and pro-poor policies, or at the institution level, but it has to be there at the individual or at the citizen level. And we call it as our 100 miles approach, which is Anubandh, where there's so much of correlation, everything is interconnected, and such economic pathways will take us to opportunities that are for the marginal, that are for the indigenous communities, and that is what, climate inclusion will lead to. And such an economy is not a violent economy for the poor citizens. It is also not violent to the economy or to the natural resources, but it is a nurturing economy. So I think what we need is to take the path of building an economy of nurturance. Sorry if I spoke too much.
No, and I remember, and I thought I think it's an error to say that you're in sync, because that feels more like a leapfrog to me. I mean, I don't know who you're in sync with. I feel like most of us are not doing any of that, and certainly, living in a largely fossil fueled world as well. So it's a really interesting vision, and I think that also shows the power of transformation when groups like yours can get together. Arjuna, I know you have to leave soon, so I guess I want to just throw a bunch of quick questions at you before, and let me know when the drop dead time is for you. But I think people will be very interested in the conversation that, there's conversations that happen grassroots, and Rima Van talked about taking NDCs and bringing down to a family planning level. But let's go back up, right? I mean, you're having conversations at the UN. And I want to understand, are they a waste of time? Or do you see that those global conversations with people like the Secretary General around climate change, there's possibility at that level to help the whole inclusion and climate conversation come together? Like what hope do you see there?
I see a lot of hope in that in terms of inclusion, because, it's very important also to emphasize in terms of inclusion in the grassroots levels. But it is also very important to emphasize and push forward for the inclusion in the global decision-making levels amongst the global leaders also. So if we see, like if I talk about the UN youth constituencies, both of UNEP, UN Environment Program, and also UNFCCC, being part of the UN youth constituencies also, we have seen that there is a huge scope of pushing forward for inclusion, and there is a huge scope to push forward for a diverse perspective of climate solution. And what is important and what is important in terms of pushing forward for a diverse solution is also because it's a global network wherein a lot of young people have joined. And this is not only in terms of UN youth constituencies, but if you also see all other all other youth networks, irrespective of UN constituencies. So I think it's also very important for us, young people, like, to break the barriers, irrespective of the institution, whether we are working within the UN system or whether we are working in the grassroots level or whether we are working in anywhere, to come together and to push forward to push forward for our own perspective, and also to ensure that there is a emphasis on inclusivity within ourselves. Because it's again two things which I feel: inclusivity within the youth movement and inclusion when we are talking about decision making processes, and it is in terms with the other entities, or it is in terms of the global leaders. So I feel it's very important, and given being member of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group, I see a lot of opportunity and scope in terms of working towards it. It's not only saying, but also it's in terms of working towards it, because we get an opportunity to work with a lot of stakeholders. And it's also bringing in the perspective that we need diverse people. Like if I say from an indigenous people's background or a young people's background, there are various tribes of indigenous people, or there are different indigenous peoples from different locations, and everyone's perspective and experience will be different, which is very much important for the climate action solution. And similarly with young people also, whether it is in terms of global south, whether it is in terms of global north, or whether it is in terms of small island countries, every young people's inclusion is very, very crucial. So what I see for me, there is a lot of opportunity amongst in the UN, and there is a lot of opportunity to not only push forward for it in terms of influencing or in terms of pushing forward your narratives, but also working together with them and along with the youth network in the national level and in a grassroots level.
And just picking up on that diversity point, because I mean, it's one of those things that cuts both ways, right? You want voices at the table, but is one voice ever going to represent the diversity of these experiences? So putting on the, thinking about the sort of the tribal side of your work, right? Is there an opportunity to bring tribal voices together, right? Are there these kind of platforms that talk about tribal voices with respect to climate change? Do we have some missing sort of institutions in that space? Or are we just overly reliant on a few individuals?
So if we see in terms of climate perspective and indigenous people, in terms of institution and in terms of framework, if we see that it's still evolving. Because, one thing which I have witnessed and I have realized, that even though indigenous people are working on climate action and biodiversity conservation, but these terminologies like climate crisis, climate action, biodiversity conservation is not something which you find it in the grassroots level. For them, it is how the situation is happening, or how cyclones are happening, how it is drought, how it is forest fire. So it's the incident, it's not the terminology, and it's the way of living. So if we see, then they have been protecting the forest. If we see, they have been advocating for the land rights and forest rights. But in terms of climate change, it is still evolving. And I think it's a lot of work also needs to be done from us indigenous communities, which we all have been coming together through our national level alliances and also national level youth networks, and also through our forest rights youth networks, also coming together, where we are also coming together in a consensus that whether it is land rights, whether it is forest rights, or whether it is livelihood issues, it is all intertwined with climate crisis. And that is why slowly and gradually we as an indigenous youth are also evolving, because it is also very important that it's not only educated youth or the youth those who have been able to access education, but it's also the youth those who have not been able to access education. And I feel have received education, I feel it's also my responsibility to ensure that youth, those who have been immensely working on the grassroots level, but those who have not received education also needs to be part of this process, because it's a co-learning and working together. So I see it is something which needs not to be, you know, one people or two people being the spokesperson or talking about it, but it is also an effort from our end as an indigenous communities, and also it's an effort from the other communities with whom we are working, that we ensure that there is more diverse representation. Because it is like, if I see my own colleagues from Manipur, my own colleagues, my friends from Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, and everywhere, they have different perspectives and different experience, which also I feel it's very important to be heard.
Well put, well put. Let me, and if you're able to stay around, Archana, that would be great, but I understand if you have to drop it. I'm gonna start this question, and it's really for everyone, but I'll start with Shloka. And Shloka, because we're friends, this is gonna be a hard question.
Oh no.
Because, you know, the thing with inclusion is, well, ultimately it's all about power as well. And, you know, look at the Indian Climate Collaborative. It's philanthropies that often have money from big businesses. It's it's other, you know, business CSR and so forth. And throughout, when we think about funding climate is generally, even the work that's been going on is funded by the existing power structures. And if you're going to try and put a perspective where, if you look at some of the tribal perspectives, the perspective that Rima Ban is talking about, rewiring the economy, right? That flies in the face of how a lot of these folks made money. And it also means giving up a lot of power. So how do we institutionally think about this? Because are we ever going to be able to make big fundamental shifts and really incorporate voices that are currently not being incorporated if the funding is coming from, you know, existing power structures?
I think it's a great question. And I'm glad you used the word institutionalization, because our actions thus far, when it comes to sort of India's climate actions specifically, have been opportunistic and non-binding. So meeting sort of the 2050 climate goals is going to require a very different approach than we've been using, you know, till date. And I think it really begins with building those necessary social movements around, you know, climate justice as well as just transition, which we've mentioned a number of times, building more inclusive interventions around climate change. And we have to institutionalize India's climate response. So, for example, the decarbonization of India's energy sector, it's going to affect the livelihoods of many, many coal-dependent communities. And we need an India that institutes a national mandate on just transition. We need to think about India from the perspective of really being a global leader in championing just, equitable, and ambitious climate action that really does leave no community behind. I don't think that's happening right now. I do agree with you that the power structures are, you know, imbalanced. But I do think that there are genuine efforts to address that, both within civil society as well as within, you know, business and industry. We are seeing sort of a different set of principles that are guiding that path. So the first is we are looking at more inclusive transition that is geographically, which is a place-based approach. We are seeing an attempt to sort of be more socially inclusive, whether that's caste or race or gender, as well as economically just. There is, you know, at least an understanding or awareness. It's gradual, but it is starting to sort of, you know, be built around the cascading effects on the surrounding ecosystems and associated sectors. So for instance, we are understanding that, you know, transitioning within, you know, one sort of sector is going to have an impact on a number of other sectors as well. And I think most important, there is an understanding that local communities need to be involved in the process of planning to those low carbon alternatives, and that resilience building measures are perhaps the most sort of important and need to be, you know, really sort of driven forward. I think We're also seeing an increase or an uptick in evidence-based scenario planning to really sort of look out for livelihood shocks and displacements. I think COVID-19 has been really telling for what we're sort of what's in store for us if we're not very careful. But I think it's a balance. A transition like this cannot be achieved when you have both political leaders who are embracing an austerity agenda that has swept the world in recent decades, but nor can it be achieved by reproducing systemic racial and gender inequalities that have been a real feature of many economies. So there has to be policy coherence across levels of government and major institutions to support the kind of outcomes that we've discussed here today, because economic growth has to be aligned with social and environmental objectives. I don't think that's in doubt anymore. But to give you an example of just one sort of, I would say, complication that goes beyond sort of, the specific institutions we work with at the ICC, I think there is a real sort of imbalance also within sort of global capital flows when it comes to the climate change challenge. One of the reasons we discussed this earlier in the conversation around sort of nature-based solutions, but one of the reasons that they've really never been sort of driven in the way that they should, or the reason we haven't seen more nature-based interventions adopted, is because they receive a fraction of the climate finance that is deployed globally. We're seeing a minuscule proportion of climate finance globally that is going towards adaptation efforts. And that is a major redressal that has to take place, not just at the national stage, but really at the global one. Out of, I think, in the last 30 years of climate financing by some of the largest international funding facilities, whether it's the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund, et cetera, a total, I think, investment of amount of about $18 billion has had, I think less than 15% of that has gone towards adaptation globally. So you're seeing, the imbalance that you pointed out, not just sort of, as I said, within domestic power structures, but really one that's being driven at a very, very sort of global narrative level. And that has to change. And I think that's why the work that is being done with grassroots organizations, the work that Rima and Archana are really talking about and that they're leading is so, so crucial, because we have to start redressing that imbalance. And it's going to have to be a bottom-up approach.
Well, so Rima Ben, let me ask you the same question, because, I think I recognize that you're a member-based organization that gives you a different type of power than most NGOs actually have, who are just reliant on external funding. But you do also receive funding from others, and you have to operate in a fairly tricky environment, right? So how much do you feel that you're able to ask for the kind of changes that you think there needs to be without, I guess, angering, existing power structures? And how free do you feel to take those on?
I think I don't feel free at all. You have to, it's like you have to be like an amoeba, that every time you have to go on changing your strategy, you have to do course correction so that you are able to navigate your way. If you do not want to, meet or work according to the agenda of the donor or of, the agency who's wanting to support, or you don't want to compromise on certain values for which you stand and for which you want to work. And therefore, I think it's you have to be working like an amoeba, that you keep changing your shape as the hour or the need demands for. And I think that is possible only if you are a member-based organization, that you go by what the needs of your members are, and you don't go by what the agenda or what the need of the donor agency is, or what the philanthropic foundation is wanting you to do. And therefore, I think there's also criticism very often that, you don't be a part of a network, or you don't really do certain kind of advocacy that is needed. but one has to look at the core has to be your members. But I think that gives us the flexibility and the freedom to stand on one's own values. And we see that as a big sacrifice as well from our part. And to what Shlokaben was just talking about, the Green Climate Fund, or, you know, the Adaptation Fund, I think it's all, you know, more meant for macro level or international NGOs. For a grassroots organization like ours, if you look at the kind of the concept note that the Green Climate Fund asks for, a 30-page document or a 40-page document, who has the time and the ability to go through those kind of documents, to churn out a concept note of that kind, and then go through all the procedures which are there. So I think we don't even look at those kind of windows for support at all. And therefore, as I was saying earlier, that, you know, poor do not wait for policies or for funds, but I think poor have to really keep innovating and standing on their own feet. And I think what is really needed, and for which we would continue advocating, is you need a climate recovery and resilience fund, which is like a, you know, blended pool, but available at a much affordable you know, means, and also accessible for the women, so that they are able to meet with the different SDGs, and yet they build their resilience to climate shocks. And that's what would be really helpful if we really want to build an economy which is a nurturing economy. And I hope at the upcoming COP meeting, there could be a special session to discuss something like this. And I think that's the need of the hour. If we look at, you know, post-COVID recovery and the economic pathways.
Yeah, and in fact, that's going to be my final question in these last 2-3 minutes we have. And maybe a positive ending, right? To just recognize that as COVID, as we're coming out of COVID, you know, fingers crossed, but a lot of learning on how, you know, the whole world went into a war footing. What is the takeaway for both of you on that with respect to climate change, and especially around inclusion, right? Because COVID is one of those things where it was very clear that you can only solve it if every single person was part of the solution, right? Vaccinations don't work if you don't give them to everybody. If everyone's habits don't change, it doesn't work. So inclusion ended up becoming like a de facto requirement, right? For selfish reasons. And, you know, the huge amounts of investment into trying to cover every type of person. I know that's not true in terms of international vaccines. So I realize that's still a hot potato to be dealing with. But is there takeaways from what you have seen, how we organized, what we did, that you think gives you some hope for the underlying and ongoing challenge of climate change that continues for us? And that's both for you, Shloka, and for Rima Ban.
Go ahead, Shloka. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was just going to ask you if you wanted to go ahead, but I also just want to say, Rima Ban, I love what you just said about, you know, sort of the inaccessibility of even those climate funds from, you know, large organizations like the Green Climate Fund, etc. I think even for us as ecosystem enablers, you know, sort of that the reason we built our platform was really so that we could be sort of that necessary, you know, step in between, or you know, institution in between that could sort of drive that funding down further. Even for us, you know, it's really sort of such a exclusionary process, unfortunately, because as I said, the funds are not sort of being driven or thought about, you know, what's really needed on the ground. So I think it's at many levels that we can't sort of access that level of funding. But just to your point, Gaurav, I think I mean, COVID-19 has really sort of demonstrated, how marginalized groups, they often lack access to services and resources, and quite frankly, even the information we need to mitigate and overcome crises. So we've seen, how certain social groups are particularly vulnerable to these sort of crises, right? Female-headed households, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous people and ethnic minorities. We've seen, landless tenants or migrant workers, sexual and, gender minorities or older people, so many socially marginalized groups that have really struggled through this pandemic. And that the root cause of their vulnerability really lies in a combination of, the geographical context, their financial and social economic status, their cultural and gender status, their access to services, or their decision-making abilities. And so I think what we have seen, though, as a result of the pandemic, and what gives me some level of hope, is an understanding that these crises, climate change specifically is not just an environmental crisis, it's a social crisis. And it's going to compel us to have to address these issues of inequality on many levels. We're seeing it between poor and wealthy countries, between, men and women, between generations. And I hope that, we continue down that path of really understanding that there is an opportunity, especially in this post-COVID period, for India to promote sustainable agriculture and sustainable public procurement, that we can have resource efficiency and circularity, across sectors and supply chains, that we can promote green jobs and green local enterprises, that we could link our post-COVID recovery efforts with the clean energy transition, with nature-based solutions and its NDCs. But of course, while all of these solutions are, incredibly important, they are incomplete if they are not accompanied by that very equally important imperative to be more inclusive in their approach. So that's where we are, and that's the hope for the future.
It's a good vision. I think it's quite hopeful. Rimaban, what do you think?
Definitely, I think I agree to what Shlokaban just mentioned, and I think the biggest learnings that we had and what our members have always taught is that every adversity also brings with it some opportunity, and that's how you're able to cope and meet with the crisis. But I think the biggest lesson is that you cannot address crisis in isolation or in a compartmentalized manner. You have to have an integrated strategy and an approach, integrating climate crisis with the pandemics, with the other man-made disasters as well. And unless and until we have that integrated approach and a strategy, we will always be struggling with one crisis after the other. The second important lesson is that we all need to address collectively, because the pandemic did not differentiate between the developed countries and the less developed, between the rich and the poor. It hit everyone in the same manner. And therefore, I think the message is loud and clear for inclusion, for building collective agencies, and looking at everyone in oneness in a holistic manner. So, how do you build sisterhood and solidarity? The third important lesson was that, local decentralized approaches function far, far better, and we're able to bounce back. So rather than, large global supply chains. So that was the third important aspect. And the fourth was that no matter how well conceptualized or designed the social protection measures are, but they only work when the basic income of the household is maintained. And that's possible only when the livelihoods are stabilized. And therefore, I think there is a definite need to look at how do you build resilience towards the livelihoods, bring security there. And last and very important is that how do you integrate with all this the digital technology? and use of data for inclusion. How can the poor, amongst them the women, also have access to data, and how data becomes a bargaining or a leveraging tool for the poor and the women? Thank you so much.
Great lessons, Rimaban, and both of you painted a very positive, I think, sort of takeaway from that. I have to say, I still sit in the camp of we might just need a revolution to get where we need to get to, which again, I think could be is also a sort of a bottom-up exercise. So you may be called upon, but look, thank you.
Gaurav, therefore, I would like to even end with more positive note, and that is our members always say, we shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in our hearts, we do believe we shall overcome. So we'll overcome the climate crisis as well someday as women.
I also didn't realize that you sang so well. Wow, okay.
I know, Rimaban, that was a treat.
But again, thank you. We're on a really great journey there. I think there's some excellent perspectives, Archana especially as well, on both youth and tribal. And I think, I've been educated, so thank you so much. I've been working, like I said, in this space for a long time, but I think the inclusion lens and how that is not something that's simply only about what is the right thing to do, but even if you're just a pragmatic human being, you need the inclusion lens to make any of these solutions work. And I think you guys gave us a lot of examples on why that is true. So thanks again. And I hope you guys have a great evening. I think we're out of time, so I'll hand it back to Sanjana. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaurav.
Thanks, Gaurav, for curating the session and also moderating it so well. Thank you so much, Ninaji and Shloka, and also Archana. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I personally learned a lot. Before we drop off, I just want to make a couple of announcements. After the session, our next session is scheduled at 8:30 p.m. IST on making global education programs inclusive with speakers like Dr. Shivani, Shailaja, and Dr. Felicia. And it's going to be moderated by Dion. So please do tune in if you're interested. The second announcement is about a very interesting app that Belong is launching, and it's called Another. And it is a short form literary content mobile app that focuses on diversity and inclusion for short South Asian audience. And it is now live on Google Play Store. And if you're interested, you can sort of download the app to get access to high quality book summaries, interviews, local reading groups, on various themes such as gender and sexuality, race, caste, etc. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning in once again. And I hope to see you all on for another panel, which is scheduled at 8:30. Thank you once again.